Hi, and welcome to this class from the Empire Business of Unit 2 of U.S. History. Today we're going to be in Episode 4, that of Imperialism. I'm Mr. Wahlberg. We have 4 objectives today. By the end of class today, you should be able to explain the economic and cultural factors that fueled the growth of American imperialism. You should be able to summarize how the United States acquired Alaska and took over the Hawaiian Islands. You should be able to contrast American opinions regarding the Cuban revolt against Spain. And you should be able to identify events that escalated the conflict between the United States and Spain. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 17. Imperialism, a term for policy for extending control over weaker nations. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, those were times of imperialism in the United States and in other strong countries. A couple of examples of it. In the late 1800s, European countries took over most of Africa as various colonies and competed for control of China and other ports in Asia. Japan was modernizing also. Japan was moving from its medieval-style feudalism to a central government with a strong leader, and they were hoping for military power that would bring economic power. And so Japan also was trying to gain control over China also. Though Americans, historically have not been all that interested in foreign territories, the United States' interest in colonial expansion was growing, and the 3 things basically fueled that American interest: the desire for military strength, the thirst for new markets, and a belief in cultural superiority. Let's talk about those individually. Subpoint B. When reading a history book, U.S. Navy Admiral Alfred T. Mahan began to formulate a theory that when countries have strong navies, they have a great influence in the world. His book, called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, published in 1890, became one of the most important texts on warfare, in particular naval warfare. It influenced American militarization as well as world militarization. He urged the United States to build up the Navy, and they did so, building 9 steel-hulled cruisers, new modern battleships such as the USS Oregon and the USS Maine. They transformed the United States into the 3rd largest naval power in the world. And this also fed the growing thirst for new markets. Things like advances in technology meant that U.S. farms and factories were producing more than Americans could consume, so there was a net surplus of production, pushing the country to find new markets in which to sell the products. That production meant the United States needed new sources for raw materials, as well as for new markets to sell it in. American imperialists thought that having overseas territories, overseas expansion would bring both of those, both new markets and new resource grounds, as well as solve unemployment problems and maybe even avoid a depression. And of course, there's always this tangle of cultural imperialism. That old ugly beast of social Darwinism convinced a lot of people of the superiority of white people, and many people argue that the United States had a duty even to Christianize. The religious baggage got caught up into this and civilized the inferior peoples, and just that whole sentence of civilizing inferior peoples, I think, tells us a lot about the motivations of this. Roman numeral number 18. William Seward had been the Secretary of State under Presidents Lincoln and Johnson, and he was arranged the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million in 1867. That was a pretty good deal by then, and even by today's standards. Seward had trouble convincing the House to fund the purchase. It was unpopular. People didn't want to buy all that snow, but arranged the purchase for $7.2 million. And, he was mocked for it. People called it Seward's icebox or Seward's folly, but Alaska was and still is rich in timber, minerals, and oil, and became a really great purchase price. Hawaii is a little bit more of a mixed bag. The same year of the Alaska purchase, the United States took over the uninhabited Midway Islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, about 1,300 miles from Hawaii. Now, since the 1790s, Hawaii had become a really important shipping station on way to China and India. Then, 30 years later, by the 1820s, American missionaries were starting schools and churches and trying to Christianize the people of Hawaii. Hawaii was its own country. It was the Kingdom of Hawaii. And the islands, by the mid-1800s, actually were significantly owned by Americans. So it's its own country, but it has major American possessions. American-owned sugar plantations ended up accounting for about 75% of the wealth of the entire country, and that drew in immigrant labor to come work there. So immigrants from China and Japan and Portugal were working in those sugar plantations, and by the turn of the century, the immigration was growing so fast in Hawaii that immigrants outnumbered Hawaiians by 3 to 1. So 75% of the population were immigrants rather than native Hawaiians. In 1887, the United States pressured Hawaii to allow a naval base at Pearl Harbor. It was the best port in the kingdom. It was probably in Hawaii's economic best interest to do so because the United States was a major landholder and also a major part of the economy. Pearl Harbor became an important refueling station for American ships. The United States was importing Hawaiian sugar to the U.S. from Hawaii without tariff. They were grown on American farms, and the farms were owned by Americans, but it was a different country, and usually imports from another country are subject to tariffs. But the United States was importing sugar without tariffs, and that really caused a growth in sugar production, a 900% growth. But the McKinley tariff in 1890, we remember from our last class, we're talking about the back and forth role of tariffs through history. By the McKinley tariff of 1890, it placed a tax on the sugar, and it made American sugar significantly cheaper than Hawaiian Hawaiian-grown sugar, and that was pretty shocking to the Hawaiian economy. It sent a shock to the Hawaiian economy. Facing new competition, American sugar planters in Hawaii called for the United States just to annex Hawaii. Wouldn't it be better if we just took over the country entirely, and then they wouldn't have to go pay the tariff duties from there? U.S. plantation owners convinced King Kalakaua to amend the U.S. Constitution by limiting suffrage to wealthy landowners. So basically say, anytime the person wanted to vote, would just to limit the suffrage to actually people that had major stake in the land, in the territory of the island. And so he amended the Constitution to do that. When about the next year, when King Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister Queen Liliuokalani, she took over, and she had a much different approach than her brother did. She had like a Hawaii for Hawaiians attitude, and she planned on re-amending the Constitution to broaden out voting. Before she got a chance to, though, U.S. businessmen organized a revolution. With the help of the United States Marines, Stanford B. Dole overthrew Queen Liliuokalani and set up a government instead basically headed by himself. President Grover Cleveland ordered that Queen Liliuokalani be restored to the throne, but he was unable to force Dole's competition. Cleveland acknowledged the new government. He basically said, okay, fine, I'll deal with the new government. But he was really unable to ever force Stanford Dole to really cooperate very well. He says, we're not going to consider annexation, which is what Dole ultimately wanted to do, so we're not, because they wanted it to be an American territory to avoid the tariffs. He said, we're not going to go take it on unless a majority of Hawaiians supported it. But the next president, William McKinley did favor annexation, and Congress proclaimed Hawaii a U.S. territory in 1898, even though Hawaiians never got a chance to vote on it. Basically, we stole a country, and it became a territory and later U.S. state. Roman numeral 19. The United States had long been interested in Cuba. For a long time, President Franklin Pierce, in the years before the Civil War, tried to buy the island from Spain in 1854, but Spain said they would rather see the island sunk into the water than have America have it. Spanish rule for the island had been cruel, though. The Spanish were known as really cruel rulers in this era, and natives tried to rebel against Spain in 1868 to 1878 in a 10-year revolution. Americans were sympathetic to the Cuban cause, and the revolt ultimately, though, was unsuccessful. Cubans were able to get slavery outlawed in 1886, which made it possible for American capitalists to invest millions of dollars in the Cuban sugar plantations. And that leads us to the Second War of Independence, when Jose Marti, the poet and journalist, launched a second revolution in 1895. This time, a guerrilla war campaign destroyed American-owned crops, and that changed American public opinion. We were a little bit more mixed on it. In one sense, we saw that, like, yes, we want to see people overthrow their colonial oppressors, but, you know, that sounds like the American story, but on the other hand, now it's causing American problems because they're burning down American plantations. Roman numeral number 20. In 1896, Spain reacted by sending the General Valeriano Weyler to Cuba. His goal there was to restore order in the island. He did so by ordering 300,000 Cubans to be put in concentration camps. American newspapers, this is a growing time of American newspapers, and they were really excited about, increasing their circulation. People wanted to know what's going on, so they seized on Weyler's action, particularly two most famous of them, a guy named Joseph Pulitzer and a guy named William Randolph Hearst. Both Hearst's New York Journal and Pulitzer's New York World, they printed these exaggerated stories of the Butcher Weyler, they called him, the Butcher Weyler. His brutality. And we call this now today yellow journalism. The yellow journalism is a sensational style of writing that exaggerated the news to allure and engage readers. It's basically like the fake news of the 1890s. Newspapers ran stories about how the Spanish were poisoning wells and they threw Cuban children into sharks, and the reports included false names and dates and details, but the whole time they're saying, like, all of this the government could substantiate. There were reports on it, and Americans just really ate that up. It deepened sympathy for the American rebels. It basically wasn't true, but it made a good story. Hearst sent Frederick Remington, this guy here in the middle of your screen. Frederick Remington was a very gifted illustrator. He's a very famous artist. He's actually, we mentioned him in our last unit as the sculptor of the Bronco Buster, the riding cowboy. But Frederick Remington was a very talented illustrator, and they, before photographs were easy to transfer around, like there was a lot of illustrations for it. So Hearst sent Remington into Florida, or into Cuba, and basically says, we need you to go document this and go get the pictures of the war and the revolution. And Remington arrived in Havana, and he sent a message back to Hearst, he sent a telegram back, and he says, there's not really revolts in the streets. There's not really a likelihood even of a war. There's no stories to cover, even though we've been covering something that looks like that. And Hearst replied back, hey, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. Just show me something, and we'll make the story fit the pictures that you send. Set point B. While public support for the war in Cuba was growing, President McKinley wanted to find a diplomatic way to bring peace there. He didn't really want to get to war. He successfully got Spain to recall General Weyler and change their policy on concentration camps, and they offered Cuba some limited self-government. Basically, William McKinley turns to the Spanish government, and he gets them to capitulate on all the worst offenses, the things that get everybody to be upset. In February of 1898, though, a letter from the Spanish mission to the United States, a guy named Enrique Enrique Dupuy de Lome. And de Lome sent a letter to the Spanish government. So he's the Spanish ambassador to the United States. He's the person most in charge of dealing with the U.S., and he's sending a letter back, and it gets intercepted. Basically, it gets intercepted and published in American newspapers. And the letter claimed that McKinley is this clown who's weak, and he's easily swayed by public opinion. He doesn't actually believe anything, and if you stand up to him, he's going to fold. Spain apologized. De Lome resigned. That's not really the kind of thing a diplomat should be writing about. So anyway, Spain backpedaled, they apologized, de Lome got fired, but the American public was pretty pissed off about it because that's just not the way the diplomats should be being behaved. It's about the same time that President McKinley ordered the United States Maine, the USS Maine, which was an armored warship. They ordered it to go sail into Cuba, and there they tried to evacuate U.S. citizens that were trapped in the conflict. The goal was basically, we said that there are Americans in Cuba. We've got a large sugar plantation population there, but if there's going to be a war split up, we need to get Americans off the island so they don't get caught in the war. And February 15th of 1898, just really, truly a few days after the de Lome letter was discovered, while stationed in Havana Harbor, the USS Maine exploded. And it exploded without any kind of warning. About 260 men were killed in the explosion and the associated sinking with it. People immediately began to think that maybe the Spanish used an undersea mine to sink the battleship, as if the harbor was going to be mined, like the party balloons on Finding Nemo. The Spanish government immediately said, we don't think it was mined, but let's go set an investigation. They commissioned an investigation into the accident. They concluded that neither the characteristics of the explosion, nor the sea conditions of the harbor that day, nor any other evidence would explain sea mines. None of that supported a theory of mine explosion. Mine explosion would also, say, for instance, kill a whole bunch of fish in the water, but there was no dead fish in the harbor there floating along with them. It didn't look like it was a mine explosion. But the Spanish concluded that probably what happened was the ship's coal bunker accidentally ignited. This happened. You got to remember these ships were fired by coal. They've got explosive materials on board, and the whole thing happens by combustion. And it would be not uncommon for a coal bunker to accidentally blow up. That did happen. And the Spanish said that's probably what happened here as well. The report, though, was not accepted by the American government, wasn't reported in the American press. At the order of the U.S. Navy, divers were sent to the wreckage. They said, okay, let's go send diving investigators down to go check it out. They discovered that the keel of the boat, which was like that runs along the bottom of the boat, it's sort of the backbone of the ship. This is the keel of the boat had been broken in half in what looked like an external explosion. It looked like the explosion came from the outside. And they concluded the mine under the ship probably also caused secondary explosions inside the coal and ammunition holds of the ship. Newspapers ran with the idea, and they said, no, this thing was blown up from the exterior, and that caused the interior explosions to be blown up. And William Randolph Hearst offered a $50,000 reward for any other person that could capture the Spaniards who would be responsible for it. We call this a cliffhanger. You'll have to tune in next time to go see where it goes. When you finish this slide, you may save and close your notes. Jesus saves, and so should you. Don't forget to like and subscribe.